Hazing in the Soviet Army, despite official rhetoric about brotherhood and equality among soldiers, was a deeply rooted and widespread phenomenon. Its forms and scale could vary from unit to unit, from district to district, but the essence remained the same: an informal hierarchy where senior soldiers, the so-called grandfathers, established their own rules and regulations, often humiliating the dignity and health of new recruits. Hazing began to grow particularly rapidly in the 1970s, when the Army increasingly became a place where people with radically different cultural, social, and even criminal backgrounds were forced to coexist. It was the law on universal military service, adopted in the USSR, that led to village boys, urban intellectuals, students, former orphanage residents, troubled teenagers, and even people with criminal records ending up in the same barracks. This explosive mixture of characters and life stories, placed in the harsh conditions of barracks life and hierarchy, naturally resulted in the practice of brutal subordination of juniors to seniors. Moreover, this subordination was unofficial, but often much more influential than the statutory one. A young soldier who had just been drafted was considered a nobody, not a comrade, not a colleague, and certainly not an equal. In the first days of service, he was given a derogatory nickname: drish, smell, disembodied spirit, air, and others. These terms literally meant, "You are not even a person here yet." Until taking the oath, which took place 2 weeks or a month and a half after arrival at the unit, the recruit was treated with outright contempt. He was not allowed to sit at the same table with the old-timers, touch their belongings, fall asleep before them, or look them in the eye without permission. After taking the oath, the recruit received a new status: spirit or greenhorn, depending on the traditions of the particular branch of the military. In the construction battalion, they were called lice; in the internal troops, wasps; in others, simply spirits, emphasizing their insignificance and ghostliness in the eyes of the old-timers. Service during this period turned into a real nightmare. The spirit was obliged to obey any orders from the grandfathers, even absurd or humiliating ones, without question. They could be forced to obtain vodka, cigarettes, wash the uniforms of their seniors, clean toilets with their bare hands, stand guard at night without having the right to do so, or perform the dirtiest and hardest work that none of the old-timers wanted to do. The senior soldiers could force the duhov to perform the most humiliating and absurd actions, to act out a demobilization train, a theatrical performance about returning home, to tell bedtime stories like to children, or, for example, to clean the boots of the grandfathers with their own socks. If a new recruit meekly accepted such treatment, he received approval from the senior soldiers and, oddly enough, a certain form of protection. They treated him a little more gently. But if he tried to resist, say no, ask questions, or refuse to participate in these humiliating games, he was beaten, could be left without food, forced to get up at night, physically and morally exhausted, turning life in the barracks into a living hell. In the collection of analytical articles, Hazing in the Army, 1991, compiled on the basis of surveys and observations in units of the Soviet Army, an interesting classification of recruits who fell under the strict hierarchy of informal authority was carried out. According to this classification, were divided into 4 conditional types: executors, flyers, greyhounds, and informers. Executors were soldiers who accepted the rules of the army game from the very beginning. They unquestioningly carried out any orders from the from the most routine to the most absurd and humiliating. Such soldiers quickly gained the tacit trust of the senior soldiers, although they remained in a subordinate position. Often, the most cruel grandfathers subsequently emerged from among the executors, as they sought to avenge their humiliation as quickly as possible. Letni were recruits who had been broken. At first, they might resist, not understand the whole system, or even try to complain. But soon, under the weight of moral pressure, physical beatings, and constant threats, they gave up and accepted the same rules. Some Letons became worse than the enforcers, trying to prove that they had learned their lesson. It was a way to survive and not end up in an even worse position. This category also included those who dropped out of reality. They began to withdraw into themselves, developing neuroses and depression. The Borzi were a rare breed. They were true nonconformists, recruits who were virtually impossible to subdue. They were not afraid of the grandfathers, did not bow down, did not obey their orders, and could openly tell a senior officer to go to hell. They were beaten, mocked, and isolated, but it was impossible to break their spirit. After a while, the grandfathers realized that such soldiers could not be influenced, and either left them alone or tried to avoid conflict, especially if the Borzi could physically defend themselves. Of course, there were also informers in the Soviet army, those who at least once complained to the officers about hazing, beatings, humiliation, or insults. Sometimes these were sincere attempts to seek justice, sometimes acts of desperation. However, the system did not forgive this. Informers were despised by everyone, both the grandfathers and even the spirits, because against the backdrop of general fear of repression and collective punishment, one soldier's complaint could spell trouble for the entire unit. Even officers treated informers with coldness. Such soldiers were considered problematic, unable to fit into the collective. If an informer became known, he could be beaten by any caste of soldiers, regardless of seniority. He could be subjected to moral and physical violence, harassment, and boycott. Informers were subjected to particularly cruel treatment in specific units, such as construction battalions, where many served with criminal records or antisocial pasts. In these places, an informer could be not only beaten, but also raped. This was considered the ultimate form of humiliation. A soldier with such a stigma began to be considered deposed, and his fate in the barracks became a living hell. He was an outcast, could not sit at the same table, slept separately, ate last, and did the dirtiest work, and all this until his discharge. Army hierarchy: spirit, elephant, scoop, grandfather, discharge. When a soldier had served for 6 months, he underwent the so-called transfer ceremony from spirit to elephant. It was an unofficial ritual, similar to an initiation ceremony. The soldier was put on all fours, the grandfathers lined up, and each one beat him on the butt with a belt, usually 5 to 10 blows. The last, final blow was delivered with a stool or a boot, calling it putting the seal. It was believed that from that moment on, the spirit officially ceased to be a spirit. He became an elephant. An elephant is a soldier who has already begun to mean something in the hierarchy but does not yet have any privileges. On the contrary, his position was the most vulnerable. He was responsible not only for his own mistakes, but also for the mistakes of the spirits. His task was to endure, curry favor, and carry out orders, including absurd ones, especially in the last 100 days before the order. This was a period that simply had to be endured. One mistake, and everything could start all over again. After about a year of service, a soldier received the rank of ladle. In the barracks hierarchy, this meant almost complete freedom. No one bothered him anymore. The ladle could set his own rules, humiliate the spirits, and command the elephants. It all depended on the soldier's personal character. Some Chirpaks behaved humanely, trying to make life easier for the new recruits, remembering how hard it had been for them. Other soldiers, who had gone through brutal hazing, accepted its rules as a matter of course and began to live by the principle, "They beat me, now I'll beat them." Such fighters became particularly cruel. They enjoyed bullying the new recruits and the elephants, considering it a kind of right of the strong and a way to assert themselves in the barracks hierarchy. They took pleasure in breaking the new recruits psychologically and physically, testing who would hold out and who would break. For them, the army became an arena of unpunished violence. 6 months before demobilization, soldiers received the unofficial but honorable status of grandfather or old man. This meant that they no longer performed any duties, could sleep as much as they wanted, rest, and command everyone who had served less time. They delegated all the dirty work and errands to the new recruits, and also gave them orders to educate the spirits and elephants. In this way, the new recruits became the tools of the grandfathers. They acted as overseers and executioners. This was the last stage before demobilization, and everyone tried to live as quietly and calmly as possible until the order came. A special category was made up of the so-called black grandfathers. These were soldiers who, for some reason, did not serve their full term. For example, they were sent to a disciplinary battalion, disbat, for violating the charter or serious misconduct. After their return, they continued their service, but they were treated with caution and respect. These people were usually cruel, nervous, and unpredictable, as they had already been to the bottom of army life. Often, black grandfathers became the most dangerous and aggressive figures in the company, and even the old men gave way to them. After the official order of demobilization, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The soldier was transitioning to demobilization status. This individual was no longer performing any duties, was preparing for discharge, sewing his dress uniform, decorating his demobilization album with photographs and appliques, and crafting his demobilization belt. He was treated like a hero. He was someone who had survived, gone through everything, who could tell stories to new recruits and show them how to hold their own. At home, his family, friends, and girlfriend were waiting for him, and this image of the victorious return was supported by both the army and society. Regional groups, an army within the army. In addition to hazing, from the mid-1960s onwards, regional groups began to form actively in the Soviet Army, close-knit groups of soldiers from the same nationality or republic. Uzbeks with Uzbeks, Tuvans with Tuvans, Dagestanis with Dagestanis. This is how informal brotherhoods were formed, within which they supported their own and could jointly oppose others. Until the end of the 1960s, the Soviet Army was mainly composed of representatives of Slavic nationalities, Ukrainians and Belarusians. These soldiers had a similar mentality, were raised in roughly the same cultural conditions, and therefore adapted more quickly to the harsh system of barracks discipline, including non-statutory relations. Army hazing, a cruel hierarchical system in which the old-timers oppressed the youngsters, was perceived by many as a kind of army initiation, a test of endurance and character. However, by the mid-1970s, the ethnic composition of the army began to change rapidly. New recruits began to arrive en masse from the republics of the Caucasus, Chechens, Dagestanis, Armenians, Georgians, as well as from Central Asia, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Turkmen, Tajiks, and Kyrgyz. These young men, often with poor Russian language skills and raised in patriarchal societies, found themselves in an unfamiliar and, as they perceived it, hostile environment, and instinctively began to band together along ethnic lines. This is how the system of Zemlyakestva, or informal associations of soldiers of the same nationality, originated and grew stronger. Zemlyakestva were something like mini-states within a company, and each member automatically received protection, support, and, most importantly, immunity. At the same time, Zemlyakestva were not subject to the rules of Dedovshchina. On the contrary, in units where the regional association dominated, it took power away from the senior Slavic soldiers, and the chain of command was based not on length of service, but on authority within the ethnic group and numerical superiority. If in the Dedovshchina units a recruit first became a spirit, humiliated and disenfranchised, subjected to beatings and performing the hardest work, then in units where regional groups dominated, a young soldier from his own could feel at ease from the very first days. He could disobey the orders of sergeants or veterans, ignore everyday discipline, and sometimes even become an aggressor towards outsiders. In addition, national regional groups differed from Dedovshchina not only in their internal organization, but also in their degree of cruelty. While Dedovshchina was a system of violence based on blind obedience according to length of service, regional groups were more like ethnic micro-communities in which the norms of behavior and respect traditional for their native cultures prevailed. As a rule, harsh but hierarchically structured relationships prevailed there, in which the younger unquestioningly obeyed the older not out of fear, but because of ingrained cultural norms. It was thanks to this that internal violence in regional associations was less common, and cases of humiliation or bullying of one's own people were the exception. The system of collective responsibility also played an important role. If one of the compatriots got into a conflict, especially with a representative of another ethnic group, the entire community immediately came to his defense. This created a powerful barrier to outside interference. For example, if a Russian grandfather raised his hand against a recruit from Central Asia or the Caucasus, he would have to deal not with one soldier, but with the entire group of fellow countrymen. This often resulted in mass brawls and, in some cases, full-scale ethnic clashes within the unit. Such cases were particularly frequent in garrisons in the Caucasus, Siberia, and the Central Asian Military District. By the mid-1980s, two parallel unofficial systems had finally formed in the Soviet Army. On the one hand, hazing, which still dominated in units with a predominance of Slavs, and on the other, regional groups that controlled companies and battalions with a high percentage of Caucasians or Central Asians. Moreover, these systems existed almost autonomously and often did not intersect in any way. In most cases, commanders and officers preferred not to interfere, but to quietly smooth over conflicts in order to avoid major incidents and publicity. As sociologist Sergei Belinovsky noted, the most influential and organized ethnic groups were those from the Caucasus, in particular Chechens, Ingush, Azerbaijanis, Dagestanis, as well as Kurds and Armenians. They were distinguished not only by their cohesion, but also by their high level of combat training, which made them particularly dangerous to other groups. Interestingly, numerical superiority was not a prerequisite for dominance. Even 4 to 5 Caucasians could completely control a company if they acted together and had authority. Central Asian communities, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Kyrgyz, were less aggressive but also very united. They actively used the language barrier as a way to avoid hard work and duties. In their first year of service, they often cited insufficient knowledge of Russian, and in their second year, they cited their high status, which allegedly prevented them from doing dirty work. The command, in turn, had no effective means of influence. Attempts to put pressure on such soldiers often led to conflicts with entire ethnic groups. However, the dominance of Central Asian soldiers in a unit was only possible if they outnumbered the rest of the unit, if they made up more than half of the personnel. Otherwise, they preferred to stay out of conflicts, not participating in either active hazing or the struggle for power. Thus, national communities became not only an ethnic phenomenon in the army, but also an alternative form of army subordination, where their own laws, unwritten statutes, and internal discipline often ignored official command structures. And, as paradoxical as it may sound, in the context of the total collapse of discipline in the late Soviet army, it was precisely these associations that sometimes became the only element of order and self-regulation.